Good afternoon, brethren. If you want a title for your notes, the title is How to Watch. In Revelation 3, there's a warning of what can happen if someone doesn't watch. It says in Revelation 3 and verse 3, "If you will not watch, I'll come upon you as a thief, and you won't know what hour I will come upon you." If you think about it, there's two problems here. The first problem is that they don't know if they're not watching. They don't know when Christ is coming. And the second problem is he's coming as a thief, and that's not good. So which problem does watching solve? Does it solve one of the two? Does it solve both? And what exactly does it mean for them to watch? Why does Christ want them to watch in the first place? And what does he want them to watch? There's all these questions that we can explore as we go through this. For the question of why, Christ addresses this in verse 2. He says in Revelation 3:2, "Be watchful and strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die, because I haven't found your works perfect before God." The reason they need to watch is because their works are, he says, less than perfect. Being watchful is associated here with solving that problem, that their works aren't perfect. And then in verse 3, it also said that watching is associated with remembering what they had received and heard, and about holding fast and repenting. Watching here in this passage is about self-change. It's about being awake spiritually and not slumbering. Some translations render it, wake up instead of be watchful. Christ is saying that if they don't watch, if they don't open their eyes, so to speak, and repent and return to what they had received and heard, then he will come like a thief in the night. And they're going to be surprised that they find he's not pleased with them, because they're church members and probably they think they're doing everything they ought to do, but their works are less than perfect. And they're not aware of that. They're not watching. And he says in the next verse, he says, "You have a few names even in Sardis who haven't defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy." And then to the people who need to watch, he says, "He who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I won't blot out his name from the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels." He's telling this church that the ones who watch, the ones who repent and hold fast, they can be like the ones who haven't defiled their garments, the ones who are worthy. And they can be clothed in white garments, and Christ will confess their name before his Father and before the angels. And this is different compared to what a thief would do. A thief would bring loss to them. A thief would bring sorrow. But if they are worthy, then what is brought to them are blessings beyond measure. The day of Christ's return will come, and it'll come upon the world like a thief in the night, because the world isn't watching, but Christians who are spiritually awake will not be caught by surprise. But you have to know how to watch, and that's the topic today. How do you watch, and especially if you find yourself in end times, because who knows, maybe we are. What does it mean to watch? Watching is different than just seeing. If you are watching, then you are actively directing your attention. You might even be using more senses than just your vision, because you are being attentive. You are doing more than just looking at something. Watching, and this is the important thing, watching means that you are trying to understand the meaning behind what you are observing. To see something is a passive activity, but watching is more active and intentional. If you're watching something, you do see it, but you're doing more than that. You're trying to understand it, watch it over time. You might say, that's not always the case. Sometimes we use the word casually. Like we have the saying, "A washed pot never boils." If I'm just looking at a pot of water, I'm not trying to understand it and understand the meaning behind it, but you actually are. If you were just looking at it, time wouldn't seem like it was passing slowly. The whole point of that saying is based on the idea that you are trying to understand if the water is ready to make tea or hot chocolate or whatever you're heating it for. You are trying to do more than just look at the water. And this active sense of the word is probably why we use it to mean exercising care when we say something like, I'm watching my diet, or watch your step. When Jesus says to the Sardis church, be watchful and strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die, it means they need to be alert and vigilant, and they need to have their eyes open, and they need to be awake and paying attention. But what is it they need to be vigilant about? It said, if you won't watch, you won't know what hour I come upon you. And this might make it sound like they should be watching the events of the world so that they know when Christ will return. And this type of watching, looking at events in the world, is the focus of a church newsletter called World News and Prophecy. And it's important. Clearly, it's important to watch these things, these events. And Matthew 24 says to pay attention to these things. So I want to make it clear, I'm not in any way saying to stop doing this kind of watching, but there is something more to pay attention to if you want that watching to be effective. As we saw earlier, when Jesus told the Sardis church to watch, he gave a reason, and that reason was to watch and strengthen, and it was because I have not found your works perfect before God. Watching CNN might cause you to strengthen your works, but maybe not. You might need to watch something else as well. I know, Fox News, right? But even that might not cause you to strengthen your works. As we saw earlier, someday the hour of Christ's return will be known to us because the hour will be upon us. In Noah's life, he spent many years preparing for a tribulation. Some think it might have been 100 years from the time he learned that the flood was coming until the waters actually started. Eventually the day came, and for the world, it was like a thief in the night. But Noah was awake, and someday the hour will come upon our world, and we need to be awake. But many have lived their entire life and not known the hour. They have lived their whole life feeling like Christ's return was imminent, but they never, in their entire life, learned when the return would be. But they did have an end, and when they are resurrected, their next conscious thought will be that Christ has returned. And so hopefully they were watchful, because the end will come one way or another. So let's look at some examples. Example 1 is the Israelites coming out of Egypt. And if you want to follow along, you can turn to Exodus 12. In ancient Egypt, the Israelites were suffering under bondage. The generation who came out had been born there, and they had lived as slaves in a land where they were oppressed. We know that they had been oppressed for at least 80 years because that's how old Moses was, and they were being oppressed when he was born. These people were descendants of Abraham, and they knew who they were. They knew which tribe they belonged to, and they knew who they descended from. They presumably also had passed along knowledge of what God had told Abraham, that a period of time would pass and they would be delivered from this oppression that had been prophesied. And it might have seemed strange to them, but all of a sudden the deliverance had happened. God had heard their cries, he had sent Moses, and things had gotten worse, like a storm before the calm. But then all of a sudden their deliverance was there, the Passover had happened, and then we read in Exodus 12 and verse 41 that it came to pass at the end of 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. And then it says, it's a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. This is the instruction that leads us to celebrate the night to be observed. The phrase, a night of solemn observance, is sometimes translated in other ways. And if you look up the word vigil on the church website, you'll see messages referring to this passage about being vigilant, because sometimes it's translated as a night of watching or a night of vigil. In Young's literal translation, it renders it this way. It says, a night of watchings it is to Jehovah, to bring them out from the land of Egypt. It is this night to Jehovah of watchings to all the sons of Israel, to their generations. So we might say that the exodus out of Egypt started with the idea of watching, on that night. And as we go through the story, we might see that the Israelites didn't do so well at watching. The first generation certainly fails, and Paul tells us that these things happened as an example for us. Let me interject a story here about the importance of watching the right thing. One time, my wife Carrie and I were at an event being put on by my company, and we were at a restaurant in Portland, and before dinner, they had a magician doing parlor tricks. And he was very good at doing tricks with ropes and coins and cards and making things disappear and appear. And we were watching carefully to try and see how the tricks were done, but he was an expert at sleight of hand, and he was very good at misdirecting us so that we wouldn't see what we wanted to see in order to understand the trick. And then after he did a few tricks, he drew our attention to his wrist, and on his wrist was a watch. And Carrie looked at it, and she looked at her wrist. That was her watch. As he was doing tricks, he removed her wristwatch, fastened it on his own wrist, and we didn't notice. But after seeing this, I watched him do it to other people, and if you know what to watch for, you can better understand the situation. You can be better at watching. And we have an adversary who wants to distract us and make us watch the wrong thing. And so with that in mind, let's look at what these Israelites were doing as they watched the wrong thing. When we think of coming out of Egypt as starting with a night of vigil or a night of watching, we might ask, what is it that they were supposed to be watching as they came out? What should their focus have been on? And the obvious answer is their focus should have been on God, on their salvation, on their deliverance. That should have been their focus. But as we look at the story of the Israelites, we see the coming out of Egypt happened a little differently than one might expect. And in particular, we might expect that since they were following God, everything would go like that song that we sang at the beginning of services, that blessed and happy is the man who never goes astray. We would think that principle would prevail and that everything they did would prosper well and so forth. And by following God, God was visibly present with them. And we read this in verse 21 of Exodus 13. It says, "The Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. He didn't take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people." And so they are following a pillar of cloud and fire. The pillar literally goes before them and leads the way. And so they are following God in a very literal sense. And they're going in orderly ranks and doing everything the right way. But then we see that God has some problems in mind for them. In Exodus 13:17, it says, "It came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God didn't lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, 'Lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt.' So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt." And then in verse 14, God tells Moses to explain these things to them. He says, "Speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea opposite Baal-zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they're bewildered by the land. The wilderness has closed in on them. And then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them. And I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord." And they did so. So God's telling them in advance what's going to happen. He tells them that Pharaoh is going to come after them and that he's taking them this way in order to entice Pharaoh to do that. The Israelites are following a visible manifestation of God's presence, and they're receiving communication from God in a very direct way through Moses. And then we read that these things start to happen in verse 5 of chapter 14. It says, "Now it was told to the king of Egypt that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was turned against the people. And they said, 'Why have we done this, that we've let the people of Israel go from serving us?' And so he gets his chariot ready and 600 more choice chariots and all the chariots of Egypt and captains. And God hardens the heart of the Pharaoh, and he pursues the children of Israel. And meanwhile, they are going out of Egypt with boldness. And when it says boldness, it means with a high hand. They are exuberant as they leave Egypt and have their freedom, but the Egyptians are pursuing them. And then they catch up and overtake them before Baal-zephon at the sea. And in verse 8, where it says boldness, they were exuberant. They were so excited about leaving. And then Pharaoh catches up with them. And why is Pharaoh doing it? It's because God is orchestrating this whole thing. God had already told the Israelites that he was sending them this way for several reasons, such as they won't be able to turn back when they see war. He told them that. And so that Pharaoh will think that they are confused and he'll come after them. He told them that. And he said he would gain honor over Pharaoh and all his army. And he said, so that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. These reasons were told to them beforehand. And the subject today is watching. So pay attention in the next verse to the words related to watching. So in verse 10, when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. And this is where they complained to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us this way to bring us up out of Egypt? Didn't we tell you in Egypt, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. So it says they lifted their eyes, and this is a type of watching. When they watched, though, they were watching the world. What they saw was an army, and their interpretation of the events was that they were going to die. When you watch, the idea is to comprehend the situation and understand the meaning of what you see. And they got the meaning very wrong. They complained to Moses, but their complaints were a mistake because they were watching the wrong thing. What were they not seeing? There was a cloud, and God was there. And God was doing something that he had even announced to them beforehand, but they were focused on the army of Pharaoh. They were focused on the things of this world, and that's what they were thinking about. And their fear caused them to hyper-focus. The people were afraid, and they blamed Moses. And then Moses tells them what they should have been watching. So Moses is looking at something different than the people. Moses said to the people, don't be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. And by hold your peace, he's saying, be quiet. Stop complaining. You don't understand what you're seeing. You can see that Moses is watching something different than the people. Moses is watching God's mighty hand and his outstretched arm. The people are watching the world. And then in verse 19, we see there's an angel there. It says, the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. So there's this angel, but they weren't watching very well and didn't have any awareness of that. They didn't seem to notice the angel or the cloud as much as they noticed the army. And that's how it is with the world, and this is where faith comes in. What we see on the news will be the things of the world. The things of the world are very immediate and real to us, but we also know that God is working something out, and we trust God. If we remember to think about God, we trust God. But sometimes watching the news might take our mind off of it. What is God working out, or what was he working out for the Israelites? Well, the angel and the pillar went behind them in verse 19 and provided darkness to the one and light to the other. And then during the night, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night and made the sea into dry land. And the waters were divided, and the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground. and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And it came to pass in the morning that God looked down and saw the Egyptians through the pillar of fire, and he troubled them and made their wheels come off so that they had trouble driving the chariots. And the Egyptians said, "Let's flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." And then God has Moses stretch out his hand, and the waters close in and drown the Egyptians and eliminate their army. And then we come to the key in verse 30, where it says, "So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses." So what we see is that God was saving them and doing something which would build faith. On Passover, they had been saved by the blood of the lamb, but they were still in Egypt after that. And then they left Egypt, but they weren't entirely out of its power. Pharaoh could still bring his army after them, but now they have been saved from this. And Paul describes this as a baptism in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 1, which you don't need to turn to, but what he says is, "Moreover, brethren, I don't want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea." So when they passed through the sea, they had water on the left and water on the right. And then Paul points out they had water above them in the form of the cloud. So they're surrounded by water, and this is sort of a form of a baptism. And so God was working that out. And they went into the water as slaves and came out as a free nation, free from Egypt, and symbolically for us, free from sin. And they saw this, and this was something good to watch for. When I say they saw this, I'm referring to the salvation of the Lord, which Moses had told them they would see. And I'm talking about what it says in the last verse of Exodus 14, which we read, where it says, "Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses." So they saw God's great work. And the result of that was they feared God. They believed God. They had faith in God, at least for a while. And God had done this to build faith. And after this, they were so joyful. They sang a song of Moses, and they sang a song of Miriam. They were free, and life was great until the next problem. And that occurs in verse 22, where Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and then they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they couldn't drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And so Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and when he cast it into the waters were made sweet. And what you notice is the people have a problem, and they complain. But you might notice they complain against Moses. God was the one orchestrating all this, but they blame the person that they're seeing. The cloud is still there, and they followed the cloud to get to this place, but they're looking at Moses, and they're looking at their problems, and they're looking at the world. But God is the one testing them, and they seem to be unaware of that. And what God says, it says he made a statute and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them. And he said, "If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." We can keep going through examples, but the point is they had so many opportunities to learn how to watch, to learn how to see God's strong arm and mighty hand acting on their behalf, and to see God's plan in action. They had so many opportunities to learn to focus on God instead of the world, but it's not easy to ignore the world. It's not easy for me, it's not easy for you, and perhaps sometimes it becomes easier for people when they are suffering and it looks like everything is lost. Maybe then it's easier to focus on God if it seems like he's your only hope. but God is always our only hope, and God should always be our focus. But sometimes it's difficult to look past the cares and problems of this world. Ultimately, Moses was able to bring them to the brink of the promised land, but the people were watching the difficulty of taking the land. They watched giants, and they watched the strength of the armies of the inhabiting people, and they said it would be better for them to die in Egypt or die in the desert than to attempt to go up against them. Joshua and Caleb were the ones focused on God, and they were the ones who made it into the promised land while the rest died in the wilderness. So the Israelites gave us an example of what not to do when we're watching. Example number 2 is King David. This is a better example. If you want to follow along, you can turn to 2 Samuel 15. There are many things we could consider in David's story, but we'll look at this one in 2 Samuel 15 and verse 13, which was a time of testing for him. So this is where a messenger comes to David, and he says, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." And so David said to all his servants who are with him in Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." So David gets this news that Absalom has a military force and the men of Israel are siding with him against David. And David realizes that he's going to be overpowered, and he doesn't want Jerusalem to be destroyed by conflict, so he flees. And then it says in verse 15 that the king's servants said to the king, "We're your servants, ready to do whatever the Lord, the king, commands." And then David went out with all his household after him, but he left 10 women, concubines, to keep the house. And the king went out with all the people after him and stopped at the outskirts. And then all his servants passed before him, and all the Kerethites and all the Pelethites and all the Gittites, 600 men who had followed him from Gath, passed before the king. And then there's something interesting. The king says to Ittai, the Gittite, "Why are you also going with us? Return and remain with the king, for you're a foreigner and also an exile from your own place. In fact, you came only yesterday. Should I make you wander up and down with us today, since I go I know not where? Return and take your brethren back. Mercy and truth be with you." And this is interesting because David's in a dire situation, and he has this friend from Gath. Gath was a Philistine city, and David had lived there for a while he was an outcast from Saul, and these guys came with him when he came back to Israel. And they're really good soldiers. Later in the story, David's going to put a third of his forces under their control for the battle against Absalom. So it's interesting that his initial suggestion is, yeah, you don't need to be in this. You can just be at peace and live in Jerusalem in peace. You don't have to help me. But then in verse 21, Ittai answers him, and he says, "As the Lord lives and as my lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there your servant will be." And so then David says to him, "Go and cross over." And then they do so. They cross over, and all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people crossed over, and they headed out toward the way of the wilderness. And so this is amazing that David inspired such loyalty from this Philistine. And I think perhaps the reason David told him, "You don't need to be involved in this," was maybe he was feeling like this was God's action against him, and maybe he wasn't sure if God would want him getting help from Philistines in this time of trouble. But then Ittai started his response with, "As Yahweh lives." And I think perhaps this changed David's outlook, and perhaps he thought of this Philistine as a godly man who was a follower of the true God, even though he was originally from Gath. And perhaps this is why he said to him, "Cross over and go with us." And next we read something which gives more indication of where David was focusing as he watched the events, because in verse 24, Zadok is there also, and all the Levites with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had finished crossing from the city. And then the king said to Zadok, "Carry the ark of God back to the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he'll bring me back and show me both it and his dwelling place. But if he says, I have no delight in you, here I am, let him do with me as seems good to him. So David says, if I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he'll bring me back. His focus is on God in all of this. He doesn't know if he'll find such favor, and he also says that if God says, I have no delight in you, David's response is, here I am, let him do with me what seems good to him. His focus is like that of Moses more than that of the Israelites. He's focusing on God, and he would like God to show him favor, but he's basically saying God's will be done. And it's not like he wasn't stressed. In the next verse, we read that David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and he wept as he went up, and he had his head covered, and he went barefoot, and all the people who were with him covered their heads, and they went up weeping as they went up. And then skipping to the next chapter in 2 Samuel 16 and verse 5, we read of David's response to Shimei's cursing. Shimei was calling David a bloodthirsty man, and he was saying that God was bringing these things upon him. And he was saying that David deserved what was happening to him. And then in verse 9, Abishai says to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Please let me go over and take off his head. But David says, what have I to do with you? Let him curse, because the Lord has said to him, curse David. Who then shall say, why have you done so? And then David said to Abishai and all his servants, see how my son who came from my own body seeks my life? How much more now may this Benjamite? Let him alone and let him curse, for so the Lord has ordered him. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today. So David isn't trying to justify himself. He just figured that this was part of God's punishment, and he was willing to take it humbly. In all of this, he trusted God through all this difficulty because he viewed the events as something that God was doing. He knew about this because the prophet Nathan had told him years before that trouble like this would come upon him for killing Uriah the Hittite and taking his wife Bathsheba. So if you find yourself in a tribulation of some sort, it's important to focus on God, as David is doing here. This is a very good example for us. David doesn't have it easy. He has great problems. He's vastly outnumbered. He's homeless. The people are rejecting him. It's about as bad as it gets. And he's just saying, it may be that God will look on my affliction and repay me good for this cursing today. And David didn't give up. He was willing to take this punishment or this testing from God, and he was humble, but he kept going. He wrote Psalm 3 about this. Psalm 3 is a short psalm. I'll read it. David says, and it was written about this time that he was fleeing from Absalom. It says, Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. Many are they who rise up against me. Many are they who say of me, there's no help for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory and the one who lifts up my head. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. I won't be afraid of tens of thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You've broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. David is experiencing the worst of times, but he has hope. His hope is God. His hope is the salvation which comes from God. And David is watching the world, but even more, he's watching it through the lens of God acting in the world. And in trying to understand the world, he's looking at it with the assumption that the events he sees are the result of God's will, and he has an awareness that God is in control. And as David seeks to understand the meaning of what is happening, this focus on God is the basis that he builds his understanding on. When we were talking about the verses in Revelation, I said that watching meant they should watch themselves, that they should examine themselves and strengthen their works, because that's what the verse said in Revelation. It said, Be watchful and strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die, for I haven't found your works perfect before God. By watching the world, the Israelites did not strengthen their works. They did not build their faith. They didn't even receive the salvation that God wanted them to have. On the other hand, David, by watching God, did examine himself quite a lot. And when you watch God, you realize how little you are. It can be humbling. David realized that he was small because he saw that God was big. Watching God helps us to watch ourselves, to know ourselves, to avoid deceiving ourselves. If we can watch God clearly and see ourselves clearly, then that is humbling. Example number 3 is Peter in Gethsemane. This is in Matthew 26, if you want to follow along, but I'm short of time, so I'm not going to read the verses. But in Matthew 26, Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus has been watching the world, watching what God is doing, and he knows that the end is coming, and he's been watching his disciples, looking at them, how they're growing and how God is using them. And he tells them in verse 31, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. And how does Jesus know this? It's because as he's been watching, he's been focused on the scriptures. And this comes from a prophecy in Zechariah. And Jesus also tells them this night again that he will be raised. So like the Israelites, Jesus has been giving them advance notice of the amazing things that God is going to be doing. Peter is very confident. He says, even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. Jesus tells Peter that he will deny him 3 times before the rooster crows. And Peter, he doesn't believe this. He denies that, saying, even if I have to die with you, I won't deny you. And it's not just Peter saying this. Verse 35 says, and so said all of his disciples. They all think they're strong. They have a certain pride as being Christ's disciples. And this is interesting. You know, they've been watching Jesus. They had seen his miracles. They had heard his teachings. They believed in him. They followed him. But they didn't really know themselves all that well yet. Jesus knew them better than they knew themselves. When they go to the garden, Jesus tells them, sit here while I go and pray over there. And he took 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John. And in verse 38, he tells them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. So it's interesting that Christ goes to pray, and he says, watch with me. So he's watching by praying, forming a connection with the Father, helping to understand and be prepared for the events that are happening. In verse 40, Jesus returns and they're sleeping. And Jesus says to Peter, what, couldn't you watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. So watching and praying can be the same thing. What is Jesus telling them? In effect, he's telling them, you don't understand the situation. You need to open your eyes. You don't know what's happening. You don't even understand yourself. You're making predictions that are wrong. You think you won't stumble, but you will. You think you won't deny me, but you will. The physical sleep they are experiencing is a metaphor for the fact they are not yet spiritually awake the way they need to be. Watching has to do with being awake. And after Peter denies Christ, his eyes are opened and he understands how little he knew himself, and he's very repentant and sorrowful. He understands now why he needed to watch and pray as Jesus had been doing. So we've had 3 examples, and I think we can see that when we are told to watch, we should put our focus first on God. And if we're troubled by the events in the world, we should understand that this isn't unusual in the history of God's people to be troubled by events in the world. And we should think about the prophecies and think about the fact that God has already told us in general terms what the future holds. And it's really good in the end. God is in control. And then with God in the picture, we should watch ourselves and ask ourselves, what kind of person am I? Am I like Peter before Gethsemane, thinking I will never stumble? Or am I like the later Peter, who in 1 Peter 5:5 said, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And then he says, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. If you watch the world, you should watch it with the perspective that God cares for you. That's in 1 Peter 5:5. And then Peter goes on to explain more about watching. In verse 8, he says, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Be vigilant means watch. Being proud interferes with our watching. Being afraid interferes with our watching. We've seen that in the examples today. The Israelites were afraid. David, less afraid. Peter was proud. David, maybe not. The Israelites watched what they were afraid of. They watched Egypt. They watched Pharaoh. They watched the army. David watched God, even in the face of extreme trouble, and David watched himself. So let's think about these examples and watch and pray.
Good afternoon. Delivering the occasional message, such as I've done, is something I've never taken lightly, as my wife would happily attest, and I'm sure this would be true for anyone privileged to speak. We're constantly looking for inspiration, a topic for which we're passionate. As for today, that inspiration came when listening to an online presentation. The host had unnecessarily complicated a subject that should have been cut and dry. Therefore, brethren, the topic and title of this message, phrased as a question, is simply this: is biblical slavery wrong? Is biblical slavery wrong? Now, I suppose you could say that's a loaded question. It's loaded because I included the word biblical, which should give pause. In other words, had I simply asked, is slavery wrong, then most, if not everyone, would affirm that slavery indeed is wrong. However, that's not how I phrased it. Therefore, let's proceed to unload the question, shall we? And in so doing, we'll expose how cut and dry this topic really is. Please turn with me to 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9. We'll begin by defining our terms because, as most realize, there's slavery and then there's slavery. Same word, different meaning, and the Bible addresses both. The King James of 1 Timothy chapter 1, beginning in verse 9, reads, knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless and the insubordinate, for the ungodly and for sinners, for the unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for fornicators, for sodomites, for kidnappers, for liars, for perjurers, and if there is anything other, or if there is any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine. Brethren, any number of other translations do a slightly better job of rendering this passage, especially in relation to a particular definition. Where the King James says kidnappers, other translations more accurately render the word as enslavers or slave traders. The actual word is andropedistas, which refers to a person who engages in the act of capturing and selling individuals as slaves. In the New Testament, it's used to describe those who exploit others for personal gain, particularly through the abhorrent practice of human trafficking. The definition continues. In the ancient Greco-Roman world, slavery was a common institution, and individuals could become slave traders through various means, including war, piracy, and kidnapping. Slave traders, or andropedistas, therefore, were those who profited from the buying and selling of human beings. Not good. Not good at all. According to Paul, this was contrary to God's law. Now, as to which one, let's go and see by turning to Exodus 21:16. As you're turning there, I wish to emphasize the biblical consistency on this. We just read a verse in the New Testament, and now we're going to the Old. In other words, the perspective on this topic didn't suddenly change between the two. Exodus chapter 21 and verse 16 says, "He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death." Now, the English language somewhat muddles the latter half of this verse. What Moses was really saying was that irrespective of whether the kidnapper sold or kept the stolen individual as a personal slave, didn't matter, because either way, they were dead. People are not chattel. In God's eyes, every person is inherently worth more. Therefore, for the purposes of this message, we'll henceforth refer to this type of slavery as captive slavery, and the Old and New Testaments agree. Captive slavery is perhaps the better known, especially in 19th century American history, namely the Civil War. Captive slavery is often accompanied by any number of factors that would contribute toward the dehumanization of people. It's also the type of slavery that seems to have persisted the most, having roots which predate Abraham. However, on a national level, in the Bible, Egypt was the first recorded empire to have captive slavery, and it was imposed to some extent on Joseph, the son of Jacob. As you may recall, his brothers threw him into a pit and then sold him. Later, the Egyptians were slave masters to the rest of the Israelites, and Moses, by the hand of God, freed them. Much later, the Israelites were again enslaved by the Assyrians and Babylonians. Other ancient nations were also involved in slavery. The Code of Hammurabi, for example, discussed it soon after Babel. Black Moors enslaved whites during their conquering of Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century AD, which then lasted for over 400 years. The Moors even took slaves as far north as Scandinavia. Meanwhile, around that same time, Norse raiders enslaved other European peoples, claiming them as property. Even today, slavery is still alive in the Sudan and the Darfur, and the examples go on and on. But you know what they all have in common? I had said there were any number of factors that contributed toward the dehumanization of people, but the most notable factor, as read in the passages from Timothy and Exodus, begins with transplanting people against their will, to which God said, it shall not be so among you. In fact, he commonly reminded Israel how they themselves were once slaves in the land of Egypt. When reading the Bible, one can't help but to trip over the many times God said this. Yet, in the world around them, harsh slavery, harsh captive slavery, whereby innocent people were exploited, remained a common thing. So much so that Moses left additional instructions concerning those fortunate enough to escape it. According to Deuteronomy 23:15, if an asylum-seeking slave sought refuge inside Israel's border, then you gave it. You neither sent them back to the country of their origin or to their master. Even after the time of Christ, the apostles contended with the issue both in and out of the church. Turn to Acts chapter 16. Let's review one quick example, not involving the brethren, but nonetheless a good illustration of how the disciples, when traveling to other provinces outside Israel's jurisdiction, would have encountered this type of thing. After all, this was the Greco-Roman world in which they lived. Acts chapter 16, beginning in verse 16, says, "Now it happened, as we went to prayer, that a certain slave girl possessed with a spirit of divination met us, who brought her masters much profit by fortune-telling. This girl followed Paul and us and cried out, saying, 'These men are the servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to us the way of salvation.' And this she did for many days. But Paul, greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, 'I command you, in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And he, meaning the demon, came out that very hour. And what follows underscores my point. Her owners were furious. They had been profiteering at this poor girl's expense, and as such, had no intention of setting her free. Therefore, what Paul had done went beyond freeing the girl of possession. He also created circumstances whereby her captors no longer had use of her. But again, captive slavery was a common thing, and the New Testament writers weren't negligent of its existence. Another example comes from 1 Peter 2. Let's go there next. Peter offered encouragement to those of all manner of background, including and especially those in need of hope, which is the circumstance we find here. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 18 begins this way. Servants, he wrote. The word for servant here literally means household slave. And so Peter tells them to be submissive to their masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. Yes, there were harsh masters, no doubt unconverted, especially given the Greek word that's used here. A more acceptable translation of skolios for harsh would be crooked, perverse, and unfair. Recall, though a capital offense by God's standards and therefore forbidden inside Israel's border, captive slavery, for which this likely describes, was common elsewhere. Remember, Peter had addressed his letter to those in dispersion. Continuing in verse 19, for this is commendable, if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. All right, with that said, having reviewed God's stance on captive slavery, we now have a foundation upon which to build. Therefore, shifting gears somewhat, let's now return to the question, is biblical slavery wrong? After all, I had said there's slavery, and then there's slavery, and we've only been dealing with one. To set this up, I'll now ask another question. How many have seen a movie called The Patriot? Okay, there's a few of us. For those of you who didn't raise your hand, I'll bet perhaps you're aware of the movie. Set during the Revolutionary War, there's a scene where the invading redcoats, led by Colonel Tavington, forcibly drafts a group of slaves working for Mel Gibson. Fighting for His Majesty, King George, the colonel explains, is an honor for which they'd be awarded freedom. In response, however, a young, dark-skinned African-American stepped forward and said, "But sir, we're already free. We work the fields." In other words, we're not slaves such as you've imagined. Rather, we're bondservants to our master. Our freedom comes by virtue of our honest labor and or repayment of debt. Or phrased another way, fighting for King George wouldn't negate what they owed to Mel Gibson. Make sense? Now, with that in mind, turn to Leviticus 25. Verses 35 through 38 talk about lending to the poor without usury or interest. In other words, treating people with dignity and respect. Remember that, because that's our baseline. In fact, reading the balance of this chapter without that knowledge is unwise. We're supposed to have an outward concern for our fellow man, Moses said. Then we arrive at verse 39, which outlines the rules for Israel's bankruptcy law. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 39 says, "And if one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. In other words, unlike the nations around you, unlike what the Egyptians did to you, but rather, verse 40, as a hired servant and a sojourner he shall be with you, and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee, and then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. Pausing there, it should be noted that if a servant was given a wife by his master, then there's another law which states that she must stay, she and the children acquired by her, which of course sounds terrible, as though some kind of separation was mandated, which was simply untrue. Instead, a dowry would be owed, no different than Jacob working 7 years for Leah and another 7 for Rachel. In other words, you didn't just get a wife for free. In any event, continuing where we left off at verse 41. He shall return to the possession of his fathers, for they are my servants, in whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him with rigor, but you shall fear your God. And as for your male and female slaves, or more appropriately translated, your servants, whom you may have from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Or again, more appropriately translated as servants. We know this because of the differing Hebrew words used throughout the text. Now, before reading any further, you may recall my inspiration for this message. I had identified an online presentation whereby the host had conflated this topic. In short, he was of the opinion that all forms of slavery were wrong, seemingly unable to differentiate between captive slavery and bond service. You see, for this fellow, the demarcation was that people shouldn't be owned, even calling it a sin, extrapolating that God's instructions thereof stopped shy of God condoning. So notwithstanding his problem with the vernacular, one commentator's observation was simply this, quote, "The Bible clearly says there's a right way to conduct slavery, or in this case, bond service, which explicitly negates the possibility that it's inherently wrong. In other words, Leviticus 25 clearly describes bond service, again, as outlined by Israel's bankruptcy law. Is it sinful then to own someone?" The position of the commenter whom I just quoted was effectively a plea for the host to show him the prohibition. Otherwise, consider the likes of verse 45, he said. "Moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you, and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property." Now, there's a word we'll come back to. Verse 46. "And you may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession. They shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with rigor." Now, technically, you couldn't rule over anyone, including the foreigner, with rigor. The only reason Moses phrased it this way was because the foreigner had no land. Therefore, unlike your fellow Israelite, departure might hurt the foreigner because they wouldn't have anywhere to go. Remember, the land given by allotment to each tribe was very important to God, as was maintaining one's tribal lineage. But it should be emphasized, the implication of retaining a servant in perpetuity was built on the premise of it being mutually beneficial and not forced. Again, for emphasis, foreigners had no possession in the land, yet chose to dwell there anyway, and purposely sold themselves into a lifetime employment contract. Plus, notice, it wasn't the government who stepped in, but a person. If someone had lost themselves to debt, they could sell the only thing they had left, which was their ability to perform labor. This was a loan, and for the Israelite, in 6 years, that loan was paid off, and they were set free. Bondservants who did this made a wage, had their debt covered, had food to eat, had a home to stay in, and on-the-job training. Dare I say, this almost sounds better than college, which doesn't cover debt, and you have to pay for it. In the same respect, a foreigner could also sell themselves into servitude, although the rules were slightly different. It was still by their own accord. Therefore, with this understanding, let's now go to Exodus 21. We'll now read what's, in my opinion, the most misunderstood passage on this topic, if not one of the most misinterpreted passages in the entire Bible. In fact, I wish we had time to cover every difficult saying, but we don't. Again, in Exodus 21, we'll read verses 20 and 21, which say, "And if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property." There's that word again. Don't worry, as was said, we'll come back to it. But concerning the balance of this verse, what does it mean? Could you beat an individual just shy of death with no fear of repercussion? Is that what the passage says? No, not even close. As with all difficult passages, this statement must harmonize with Scripture. In fact, you could say that Moses shorthanded numerous topics. Unlike the Apostle Paul, who tended to over-explain things, Moses did the opposite. Therefore, to break this down, let's first consider the words of Jesus by turning to Luke chapter 12. Leave your finger here, though, because we'll come back. In Luke 12, Jesus had something to say about those who beat servants, and he didn't leave much ambiguity. Therefore, beginning in verse 43, Jesus said, "Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly, I say to you that he will make him ruler over all that he has. But if that servant says in his heart, 'My master is delaying in his coming,' and begins to beat the male and female servants, and to eat and drink and be drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour when he is not aware, and will cut him in two and appoint him his portion with the unbelievers." Now, with that in mind, let's head back to Exodus 21. Let's read this again, but this time pausing for explanation. Verse 20 says, "And if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished." And what punishment would that be? For the answer, you don't have to go very far. Only 8 verses before, Moses said, "Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death." Leviticus 24:17 says the same thing. Meanwhile, Genesis 9:6 phrases it this way: "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed." So the punishment was commensurate. It fit the crime, which in this case is plainly stated in the same chapter. You kill your servant, you're dead. Now we're ready for verse 21. "Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property." Simply stated, brethren, this wasn't about the servant dying, even after a day or two. That was already addressed in the previous verse. Rather, this phrase addresses the situation where a servant recovers, meaning that capital punishment was no longer applicable. The Lambda Bible, for example, taken from the Aramaic, has perhaps the best rendering of this verse, and it says, "But if the victim is well after a day or two." Meanwhile, a handful of other translations has the servant up and walking around. In other words, the law here implies a period of observation, aka a day or two, in order to determine the severity of his injuries. This reflects a legal principle assessing the outcome before determining culpability, and is echoed in other parts of the Mosaic Law where restitution and proportional justice are emphasized. But more importantly, it's crucial to understand that beating your servants here began with the word if, an acknowledgement that such could happen, not that it should, but either way, there would be consequences, not the absence thereof. We know this because only 6 verses later, Moses wrote that if an owner were to knock out even so much as a single tooth belonging to his servant, then that servant would be awarded immediate freedom. So how's that for consequences, or the lack thereof? Was there retribution for poor behavior then? Absolutely. Therefore, ultimately, these passages show us the importance of treating people well, including and especially the foreigner within our gates, because if they believe and adjoin themselves to us, they too may be counted among God's people, such as Rahab and Ruth, to name but 2. Now, in my opinion, we can and probably should attribute at least some confusion on this topic to a limited vocabulary. That is to say, similar words are used to describe something altogether different. As was said, there's slavery, and then there's slavery. There's captive, and then there's voluntary bond service. And the latter, if wrong, means the volunteer would be just as guilty. Plus, masters were in the church. To see what I mean, turn to Ephesians chapter 6. What we're about to read is sprinkled throughout the New Testament. So we'll look at several examples, the first of which is here in Ephesians 6. For context, we'll pick up the account in verse 5. Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. And to notice what comes next, verse 9. And you masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. All right, so clearly some masters, bond servant owners, whatever you want to call them, were taking advantage of the situation, using their position to lord it over those whom they had control. Sound familiar? We've all had bosses whom we thought were evil, but in this case, Paul included them in his letter, meaning they were in the church. And not just in Ephesus, but also in Colossae. Notice Colossians chapter 4, verse 1. You're welcome to turn there, or you're welcome to write that down. Colossians chapter 4, verse 1 says, Masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Now, if owning someone were wrong, or even a sin, as believed by some, then you'd be hard-pressed to explain why Paul didn't call them out. At the very least, you'd think he'd say, hey, McFly, what are you doing? You're a baptized member in God's church. Now, he did, of course, call out their poor conduct, but not for engaging in bond service, whereby again you're said to own someone. Which brings us back to that word, property. I had said that we'd revisit what's meant there. Now, admittedly, in English, it sounds awful, doesn't it, that someone could be your property? But notwithstanding Moses' proclivity to shorthand various expressions, what if I told you that word, property, in Hebrew, literally means silver. It's your money. Or, said in another way that's more digestible to our 21st century ear, your servant represents your investment. Hello, I'd like for you to meet my intern, my personal assistant, in whom I have a vested interest. Or as conveyed in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18, imagine Jesus saying, hello, I'd like for you to meet those whom I redeemed with something more precious than silver, in whom I have a vested interest, and to whom I have given an earnest or down payment. Oh, all of a sudden, the idea that you could be someone's property just got a whole lot better, didn't it? However, before exploring this current thought, let's first conclude the previous point by going to 1 Timothy chapter 6. We'll read one more account, like the previous two, whereby Paul delivered instructions to Timothy. He said in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 1, let as many bondservants as are under the yoke count their own masters worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and his doctrine may not be blasphemed. Verse 2, and those who have believing masters, again referencing bondservant masters who were in the church, let them not despise their servants because they are brethren, but rather serve them because those who are benefited are believers and beloved. Teach and exhort these things. So yeah, as previously said, some were abusing their office, such as common to man, and that needed to be corrected, but that doesn't undermine the premise itself. In other words, you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Paul condemned poor attitudes, not the institution of slavery, aka bond service, as outlined by Israel's bankruptcy law. Here he gave clear instructions that Christian masters were to treat such people with respect and as equals, meaning their employment position did not affect their standing in the church, as elsewhere written. Galatians 3:28 shares, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Again, attitude. An employer who fostered a good working relationship with their servants and vice versa is what Moses always intended. So why? Why get caught up in the vernacular? Brethren, one could spend a lifetime wallowing in the verbal weeds and expressionary statements rooted in a cultural time frame that's long since faded. Regarding the use of slavery as an allegory, however, turn over to Romans 6. As you're turning there, I should mention that Paul referred to himself as a bondservant or slave of Jesus Christ in chapter 1, and so revisits the concept here in chapter 6. For context, we'll begin reading in verse 15. What then, Paul says, shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? Certainly not. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one slaves whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness? Well, from this perspective, we're all slaves, which comes as no surprise. You were purchased at your baptism. Verse 17, but God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered, and having been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. Dropping down to verse 22. But now, having been set free from sin and having become slaves of God, you have your fruit to holiness, and the end, everlasting life. For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. As a living allegory, this is powerful. Just as bond service was voluntary, so too was our response to his calling. else it wouldn't mean anything. God sees no value in chattel nor forced servitude, but a willing, subservient heart, for whom he made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth. That's from Acts 17:26, which needed to be referenced. You can't give a sermon on slavery without mentioning race, at least once. The use of the term one blood in Acts 17:26 is so significant because if races were of different bloods, then we couldn't all be saved by the shedding of one blood. Rather, it's because the entire human race is descended from one man, Adam, that we can trust in one Savior, Jesus Christ. In conclusion, to restate the previous point, just as bond service was voluntary, so too was our response to his calling, whereby we recognized our own moral bankruptcy. And although physical, the fact that Israel's bond service laws were predicated on the same principles of bankruptcy was no coincidence. The parallels are uncanny. Therefore, to recap, point number one, holistically different from the harshly treated slaves of other societies for which God condemned, slaves under the Mosaic law were bondservants. Point number two, a bondservant was acquired when a person voluntarily entered it because he needed to pay off his debts. Point number three, foreshadowing the inclusion of Gentiles, foreigners could also sell themselves as bondservants into the Commonwealth of Israel. Point number four, although some Israelite benefactors abused their rank, the Bible offers clear instructions and regulations for the fair treatment of servants and reveals they are equal under Christ. And finally, point number five, spiritually speaking, we're all bondservants. Same word as slave, yet separated by context, something for which even the King James isn't consistent on. In other words, you could say that we were slaves because sin held us captive. But now we're bondservants because our response was voluntary. Have we not all experienced a moral bankruptcy for which redemption was paid? Indeed. Again, it's a living allegory. Was biblical slavery therefore wrong? The answer is no. Happy Sabbath.